We are delighted to announce the launch of Extraordinary Women in Tech Conference, taking place this December at the Intercontinental Hotel in San Francisco. Join this truly global peer-to-peer conference. Add your name to the list of best and brightest female minds, joining together to advance the movement of women leadership in technology. Meet investors and pitch your startup ideas. Get career advice from other tech-savvy female executives. Be featured in our dedicated podcast channel. Enjoy the glamour of the Red Carpet Gala, amplifying women's voices. Come celebrate the achievements of you, an extraordinary woman in tech.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining our panel today. I'm very excited to present this special edition of the Extraordinary Women in Tech session. But prior to starting, I did just want to point your attention back to the video you just saw. We have had such a fantastic time running this webinar series for the last year and a half, and are thrilled to announce that this year in San Francisco, we're going to be hosting the first of its kind global peer-to-peer networking platform for top female executives in IT. So now with the end of COVID, hopefully around the corner, at least in the US, we are welcoming women in leadership from all around the world to come and network with one another in person in San Francisco. You can also attend digitally, and I encourage you to check it out because the early bird pricing is actually just about to expire on August 1st. But today we have a very special session of the Extraordinary Women in Tech webinar series, and it's my pleasure to introduce our panelists today. We're going to be introducing panelists in the order in which they agreed to participate. So first up, I'd like you to help me welcoming Sarah Andrews. Sarah is the IT manager at Refrigerative Supply Limited in Vancouver. Sarah's been working in IT for over 25 years and is also a qualified credit management professional, having held dual roles until 5 years ago. She was on the team that brought the first computer system into the organization back in the 90s and has witnessed firsthand business transformation across 3 decades, back from 5-part handwritten forms to today's paperless environment. And along the way, there have been lots of lessons learned about change and bringing business value through IT. Welcome, Sarah. Next, I'd like to welcome Alexandra Montgomery. Alexandra is the Director of IT, Digital and Innovation North America at Sodexo. Alexandra supports the home care segment, where she's been responsible for leading enterprise architecture, data initiatives, and various digital transformation and innovation projects that leverage technology to enhance the lives of clients and caregivers. Welcome, Alexandra.
Hey.
And last but not least, it's my pleasure to welcome Lilian Itajiba-Kuto, the founder and VP of Product at Maverick Disruption. Lilian is the co-founder of Maverick Disruption, which is a transatlantic product development and validation consultancy. She brings over 20 years of experience in the UK with advertising, startup, and technology industries with a background in fine arts and dance performance. She helps medium to large-scale organizations to align their teams around ideas, features, and market hypotheses in order to design products and services that customers really want. Welcome, Lilian.
Hello, everyone from Montreal. Very hot Montreal.
We have a truly global panel today. I think all 3 of our panelists hail from Canada, but we're rather distributed. So it's nice to be connected all over the world. So as you may have garnered from the backgrounds of these extraordinary panelists, I'm so excited because our topic today is around centering users in strategic decision making. And traditionally, this is a discipline that we typically associate with design, possibly with digital transformation, maybe management consulting. But as you can see, what we've aligned around is that this topic is of interest, it is relevant, and it is important across a variety of different industries. But before we get into our panel questions, I actually have an icebreaker question for the group, and I'm going to start by sharing my own answer. But the icebreaker question is this: what is the best piece of advice that you've ever been given, whether it relates to business or personal life or anything else? And mine is a piece of advice that I got from my parents. So they gave me this advice in relation to being married, but I think it's really applicable in business and everywhere as well. And that advice is, when you're wrong, say sorry fast and get back to having fun. So I'd like to ask in reverse order, Lilian, I'll ask you first to share what's the best piece of advice that you've ever been given.
I've had quite a few, but one in particular sticks to my mind and is one of my dance teachers who said you don't always have to land on your feet, which kind of works for the body, but also works in life in general, because the whole point of that is that sometimes, you can fall on your knees, you can fall on your side, and you kind of come up with different ways, either of like getting back up or really better, more efficient, fast ways of actually standing on your feet. And it's kind of related to this industry that failing might bring something positive in the end of the day and kind of, create different pathways into your way up again.
Absolutely. Lovely. Alexandra, how about you? What's the best piece of advice you've ever been given?
So I would say the best piece of advice I've been given is not through an actual statement, but I think it's through action, and observation. And it's really to take a step back and pause. And I know it's something that sounds so simple, but what I've learned is, sometimes we want to fire off an email. We want to get back to our building text messages. And sometimes there's deadlines that are quickly approaching. And so we become reactive to those situations instead of being thoughtful or strategic. And in the real world, there's technological constraints, budget concerns, and timelines that all need to be considered. And so I found, say you don't know when you don't know, and awkward silence and pauses can really be a good thing, and really let go of perfect when you take a moment and pause, you'll come out with a better decision in the end.
Beautiful. I love that. I read recently that problem solving can in fact become addictive. And sometimes we're solving problems just because it feels good to be in action, when in reality, it would be better to take a step back and think it through first. And Sarah, how about you? What's the best piece of advice you've ever been given?
Well, that's great pieces of advice from yourself, Holly, and from Alexandra and Lily. And so more advice to build on. But one of the best pieces of advice, and I've had a lot over the years as well, that I was thinking through is, reach outside your siloed role. Just because you're in a specific role in a business doesn't mean you can't learn about all aspects of that particular business. And the advantage of that, well, there are many, but one of the key advantages is when you reach outside your silo and go and talk to people in different areas, you'll be able to find a problem that those people are dealing with. And then you have an opportunity to solve it. And if you can solve a problem for the business, that's how you will get noticed. So I think that's a critical piece. Yeah.
I love that advice, because I think you sprinkled in a little hint of something that we're going to touch on later as it relates to having a diversity of perspectives, right?
Yeah.
Wonderful. So I think that's actually a fantastic bridge, and let's jump right into the panel questions that we have. So, when we first started to organize this webinar and we were internally discussing about topics, something I really wanted to discuss was around user-centric decision-making and how broadly applicable that is. And I think one of the questions that was raised internally is that going to limit this session just to designers? And I think we have a clear answer that no, it's not just about designers. It may be particularly the province of designers in relation to design thinking. But my first question is, outside of the design discipline proper, where have you seen user-centric thinking brought to bear? And Alexandra, I'll start with you.
Yeah, so my mind sort of goes to a few places when you ask that. And so first, I think of how we've been conducting what we call consumer panel feedback sessions, and that's so that we can really understand and hold a more qualitative research approach versus quantitative with our clients. It's not enough sometimes to just have the yes, no. We want to know the yes, no, and more. And so on top of that too, we conduct surveys to our end users. So whether that's our franchisees, our clients, our caregivers, or corporate staff, so that we know for fact what needs to be improved and where our focus needs to be. It doesn't need to be perfect always in the outcome. We try to be as agile as possible and test the idea, gather the feedback quickly, and improve from there. But at least we have a starting point to pivot from.
Beautiful. I love that. And Sarah, how about in your experience, where have you seen user-centric thinking brought to bear outside of the design discipline itself?
Yeah, we don't do a lot of design. We use software that other people have designed. So it's a different view of it, but we can modify to a certain degree. So one of the things that's very important is our customer service aspects. Our customer service representatives need to move quickly to get customers in and out of the building if they're ordering or on and off the phone. So time is money to our customers, their tradespeople. So ongoing focus we have is to make the ERP that we use more streamlined for our customer service people. So what we did is we worked over the past few years to make that happen. And we actually took process flows and how a customer would typically order an item, what question would they ask first. And we tried to align our screens as much as possible along that data entry flow. So we had less moving around. We also looked at changing font sizes for important pieces of information, highlighting critical areas with color, and providing more drill downs than the out-of-the-box solution provided so people could get the information they needed quickly. We also, on a hardware perspective, gave people two larger screens. They had one smaller screen. So most of our staff now on the front line have the two larger screens so they can open up multiple screens more easily and have more real estate to look at things. Our goal really internally was to improve our order entry time by up to 20%. And I think we've met, if not exceeded that. So we've made some real improvements to the business and to our customers from that aspect.
You know what I love about that answer, Sarah, is that you're actually going beyond what appears on the screen, and you're going beyond what maybe your preconceived notion of a good system would look like. You're actually thinking about, what does it look like when they sit down at their desk? How big is their screen? What is it that they're interacting with day to day? What colors are going to work for them? I think what you're pointing to is that centering the user, it's way more than software. It's way more than design. It's all about life. It's about how they're interacting with what's around them. And it seems like you took a very boots on the ground approach to it, which is always the best way to go.
Yeah, well, yeah. 8 hours a day, you're looking at the same information. You want to make sure you make people, well, IT is all about, good IT is all about making people's jobs easier. Really.
That's right.
And that's what we try to do. Yep.
So speaking of which, there's something interesting that happens every time I speak with one of my clients or prospects about the importance of user-centric thinking, about running design thinking workshops, about why it's important to, as Alexandra mentioned, kind of take a step back and think about the why of what you're doing. And that's that when we start talking about user-centric thinking, it feels intuitive. It feels like if you say, hey, you should design products and services with the end user in mind, nobody's going to say, no, you shouldn't. So it feels like it's very intuitive. Is it in your experience? And Lillian, I'll start with you.
I'm still muted.
Do we have you, Lillian? Oh, there we are.
Yeah, I'm just having a chat to myself. It's basically how design, is that what you seem like? Seems like it comes to intuition, isn't it? You're talking about, isn't it? The user-centric design. Because it seems intuitive. So have you found it to be intuitive? Do most companies, do most decision makers operate in a user-centric fashion naturally? I don't think they do. I think that people tend to come to approach ideas, especially in my experience as a coach, it very much so in a user expertise rather than a human factor. Because if you think about it, humans, we tend to have like a background to us, and we're very kind of instinctive in how we approach things with our bodies, with our eyes, with our hands. And that's why some of the most successful technologies we can think about is things like touch screens and swipe, because it emulates things like, turning a page to a book and everything. So the way I find is that you need to kind of like design products or services is in a way that it doesn't require that expertise, if you know what I'm saying. It's like that it triggers some kind of curiosity and collaboration from the user or human themselves to actually interact with your product. And that can apply to anything from an application, from a toy, from a piece of food. And because what we want is to people to not require, a a clear understanding technically before they actually use whatever you're actually building for them. And you need to be able to put yourself in their shoes culturally, socially, and anything. Does that make sense?
It absolutely does. And I think one of the things that I admire so much about your work is how grounded in the physical body you are when you talk about making decisions that are in fact intuitive to users. You know, that idea of swiping, that it's a very natural thing, or using your hands in a specific way. I love that. And I think I would be curious, and perhaps you're already planning to share this, if you could talk a little bit about where that groundedness in the physical experience comes from.
Well, for me, obviously, I've got a background in theater and dance and so forth, but I also see in terms like if you look at a child, for example, or your mom, let's say, when they get a piece of technology, what do they do first? When they get it out the box, you know, they're trying to figure things out. You know, people who are cautious, they try to figure out the instruction manuals. But if you give that to a child, let's say, or somebody who doesn't understand the language, the instructions that written in, they try to figure out with their hands and they move it, you know. So whenever you create something, don't make it daunting or intimidating for people. Just incentive them to actually touch it. I can't remember, it was many years ago. They did an experiment in India by putting computers in urban area, poor areas in India for street kids to interact with. And it didn't take that long for the kids to suddenly start to become like computer literate just by interacting with these objects that were in front of them. So I think there's an element of trust. And one of the advantages of this terrible lockdown is the fact that, you know, people have becoming a little bit more brave in terms of adopting technologies. You know, things like Zoom don't seem, you know, scary anymore to people. Like even your grandma is going to like pick this up, or somebody who's never like touched a computer before. So there's 4 kind of elements to this for me. And I think it's to instigate curiosity instead of suspicion, collaboration instead of persuasion. So we kind of want people to collaborate with you as being co-designers and co-creators. And, you know, incentive as opposed to fear. So we don't want them to kind of like be intimidated by something. And we don't want them to have expert knowledge before they actually, you know, go to your place or feel like, you know, it's not their place. Let's say you're developing like a high street fashion or like something, or like a really nice champagne, for example. You shouldn't feel like you need to know about champagne or wine before you kind of interact with it. So make it fun. Maybe it's something like, tell them a story, I guess. You know, for example, like if you're trying to explain to somebody to move a leg a particular way. So instead of saying, okay, lift your foot and lift your heel and then like really fast towards the front, you could simply say, imagine you're kicking a ball, you know, because that's what makes a human distinguished from, you know, a user. I mean, I hope that makes sense. Because I'm throwing.
That's such a fantastic example. I think everybody was probably kicking their leg under the table here.
Well, exactly. Imagine if you try. That's why they have real problems explaining to robots. Let's say putting a T-shirt on, because robots are very logic. But you know, even if you give a little child, you know, they might, the first time you give a T-shirt to a 2-year-old to fit, he will try, but you know, a robot is going to get stuck forever because it needs logic. You know, okay, lift your arm here, and you never put a T-shirt in the same way, even if it looks like you do. There's always a slight variation in how you do things.
That human element, that tactile element, that's great. And Sarah, how about in your experience, when you think about user-centric thinking, is it as intuitive as it seems?
No, I would say it's not. And from my perspective, you know, I'm mostly dealing with ERP, for example. So ERP is really the IT industry's apps in a box, right? They created that. And of course, they're a significant source of data for most businesses, but do they utilize, you know, user-centric thinking? I don't know about that. I think they try. Some of them are quite old, so they probably a foreign concept, but they're intended to appeal to a wide market. And the downside of that is they have specific and limited menus. So that restricts your user-centric thinking options. You know, you have to work within that confine. So for a business, that can affect your established processes, and it can actually affect your ability to differentiate. They're making significant strides, but they have a long way to go. And that's one of the things that we struggle with, is to make changes in the ERP, as we talked about with the order entry, that actually work for how our people want to work.
That's right. I think, in Avenue Code, when we run design thinking workshops, we do an exercise, which is to throw out the window everything that occurs as a limitation. And you see people get visibly uncomfortable when you ask them not to think about budget, not to think about what seems possible, because the majority of the time, you may think you're making user-centric decisions when in fact, you're making decisions based on what feels doable, what feels achievable, what feels like it's going to check a box. And that's kind of unfortunate, because it does limit the creativity. It limits that very tactile thing that Lillian was getting at, which is let's think about how humans work and design and create around that.
Yeah.
And Alexandra, I want to ask you your perspective on this as well.
Yeah, so I think, as the other ladies mentioned, the short answer is no. But part of my role in IT, and Lillian, this is leaning into what you said, is to help people really understand that the best ideas come from those right on the ground encountering the problem you're trying to solve, and not top down. And so we need to interview everyone. Everyone becomes a stakeholder when we're looking into a potential project or solution for implementation. And so often, we have our own assumptions based on our experiences and the ways that we think something should be. And what I try to do is to look at the data that we have, if it is available, and take that back to our stakeholders and say, okay, this is what the data is showing us. How do we pivot or action based on that? And then begin interviewing everyone from there, depending on the project and the needs, of course. But, everyone always thinks that they have the best idea, and they might at the end, right? But it's, fact versus how you personally feel, and or maybe what his opinion is, and so on. And then it gets really important, and we've kind of touched on this already, but because when you have the data to help guide you, then it becomes non-bias as well, and it just becomes your next option. And removing that bias of, this is how I've always done it, or, especially when you've been in a role for the same, for a long period of time, and with a company for a long period of time, that becomes really hard to remove that existing thought that everyone has mentioned as well of, okay, let's scrap how that was done in the past, and let's look at potentially this new way of doing things. So.
Yeah, I think you get at such an important point here, which is that the factors are not even necessarily only bounded by what feels possible, but also by factors like, I'm really attached to this idea, or maybe there's sort of political things where people get rallying support around a specific idea, which may or may not have much to do with what users need. When we interview researchers and designers in Avenue Code, one of the questions that we ask them is, how do you deal with it when the data you collect isn't what your stakeholders want to hear? Because that's a whole discipline in and of itself, right? And I'm curious for each of you, if you have, without breaching any NDAs, what is the funniest example you can share of a belly flop that resulted from failure to center the users? And I'll let you continue, Alexandra, since you started.
Yeah, so unfortunately, I don't have a funny story, but I wish I did. And maybe there's one, back in my mind. But I think really the truth is that sometimes when you launch something, you think you've interviewed everyone. You think you've done everything that we've just talked about, and you still miss something. And it can be really big, or it can be minor sometimes. And that's when you kind of want to go behind the curtain in those moments. But I think those are the times that it actually becomes the most valuable, and you get those key learnings that and kind of reflect that you still wouldn't be at that point you were at without going through, the process that you did. And no process improvement is safe from scrutiny. And being able to say, hey, this didn't work, and we're going to try this instead, and really own it, it can also be powerful. So sometimes I always think of, being forward thinking is also understanding what went wrong.
Mm-hmm. I love that. Yeah. And that goes back to your point about failure being something that we can learn from, or even as Lillian said in the beginning, even if you don't land on your feet, there's possibly something to be learned from that. Sarah, how about in your opinion, any funny stories you can share, or maybe sad stories you can share of
well, it's sort of, it starts out sad and it ends up kind of funny. So we had a requirement to do a report a few years ago, and it was quite difficult to do that report. And the people, it was the accounting department, I think, that was doing the report, but not IT. So people got together and said, okay, well, here's a new way we can gather the data we need and make this report more automated. So let's just add a field in the order entry program, and that will allow us to gather the information better. So we did. And within 48 hours, we were forced to pull it out because it affected the kind of muscle memory, if you will, of people that were doing the order entry. And it really played havoc, slowed them down, and they absolutely hated it. So the funny part of the story is that we now have a code word in IT that relates to that, that whenever we're talking about changing things that may affect people, and back to what Alexandra and Lillian have both said, you know, make sure you cover all your audience. We just drop that code word in the middle of conversations and remind ourselves that, hey, let's not go down that road again if we don't have to, you know. So it's sort of one of those things that just sticks like a little fable.
Absolutely. I love it. You know, as long as you're learning, right? And I think that's the takeaway here, right? Nobody is immune from this. This isn't about shaming any particular company. I think everyone has had that moment of, oh, we didn't really think this through. I mean, we see it all the time as a consultancy. Whenever we're consulting with a new company and they come to us, they have an idea, they're ready to build it, and it's like, of course we can build that for you. Are you sure that's what you want? Should we back up and think about that why? Let's validate this first. And many times it's a good place to pause, because there may be some additional insights, and maybe even a small pivot can get you where you're trying to go a lot faster. Great. And you know, another thing that I wanted to talk about is I think there's often a perception of users as this kind of abstracted personas who might want to buy our products or use our services. But when we think about users, who are some overlooked users that we should also be centering in our strategic decision making? And Sarah, let me go to you first on this one, because I think when you talked about the folks entering data, that's a different kind of user, isn't it?
Yeah, that's a user that would be doing repetitive processes day after day, potentially, you know, under pressure. But we also have users that are outside that. We have our suppliers that supply our products that we sell. We have our customers, right? Because we're wholesale, so we sell to people who sell to others. And we also have even people at home that maybe are looking for products that we're helping to protect in grocery stores or in laboratories. I mean, in the refrigeration business, that exists everywhere. And I always say it exists from mushrooms to morgues. And if you think about, you know, we're all talking about how hot it is, but just before the seminar started, and that's one aspect of the environment of keeping things cool. And you know, hopefully no one's going to lose a whole bunch of money because an air conditioner broke. You can certainly see a lot of people losing a lot of money if a big freezer compartment in a grocery store, for example, or Costco, you know, isn't working. So we support that, the upkeep of those devices. So we have our supply chain, and we look at it holistically. Our entire marketplace is our supply chain and needs to be invested in our success as we are invested in their success. And so when we look at our users, we consider everyone. So my quote around this is something from Howard Schultz of Starbucks, who basically, I heard him talk at a conference, and he said, when he has his decision makers in a room, there is always one chair that is empty, and that chair represents the customer and the staff. And if any decision they make in that room may negatively affect either one of those two parties, they stop and rethink that decision. So I think that's a guideline that, you know, we can all use around what are we doing, and that, to Alexandra's point of slowing down and thinking rather than just reacting, and to what Lillian said about, you know, the great illustration of how to kick a ball, you know, make sure that you are actually knowing how you're going to kick that ball before you put it forward, right? So that's, I think that's a good piece of advice. So yeah, everyone can be affected by something that you do. downstream. So you
Yeah.
need to make sure you include all those people.
It's quite holistic. You're kind of zooming out and you're looking at the entire ecosystem and everyone within that as users. And I think that's such a unique perspective and one that we could definitely benefit from seeing more of. And Alexandra, in your opinion, who are some of the most overlooked users that don't typically get centered in strategic decision making?
Yeah, so I think other than sort of the obvious two that Sarah has mentioned, your clients, maybe your employees, down to your suppliers as well. But I think being inclusive also means thinking of every possible user in our digital first world now. So whether that's age, gender, race, socioeconomic background, the building that you're operating in, which is kind of what Sarah also touched on, but and how you interact with them, everyone is a potential user. And it's hard to always think of all of those, situations. So that's a great quote as well to reference because it's really important, I think, to turn up the volume on customer feedback and be conscious of the responsibility that we carry. And in the business that I help support, especially because we're in the business of caring for people's loved ones and keeping them safe at home. So that becomes really important for us.
It's such a good reminder. I think despite a lot of good intentions, we're so far from actually being inclusive and centering voices that traditionally have not been given much of a platform. And it's a very timely reminder. And Lillian, how about in your experience?
Yeah, I think Sarah did mention something, but I feel like, especially in our days where you have these companies that almost represent the products themselves, you got the cult of the CEO. And I feel like the people behind the product, the people who create and design and develop these products, should also be our users, the company itself. So, and this is often the parts that we tend to neglect because we're so busy thinking, what it's like to be a user of our product, what it's like, but then what about you? What about people behind the design? Because at the end of the day, the people helping you creating it, these are going to be your ambassadors. These are going to be the people who are going to bring the values and the vision and the mission of your product. And it's very important that they live and breathe that. And when I work with my workshop, I will often include not only the customer, but I will include a different flavor of each position in a company or, the people who should be stakeholders in a project or the idea. So you're going to have the finance guy, you're going to have the designer, you're going to have the developer, you're going to have the marketing person. So all of these are going to be potential users. They're going to be behind this mission that your product or your service will instigate. And I think that's often what we neglect. Because if we don't enjoy or we don't love what we're building, what is the point of trying to sell that to somebody else? We can have all the KPIs in the world. We can be able to, we're always able to tap on, like I said before, like fear, primeval instinct, instant reward gratification. But at the end of the day, is what holds your loyal customers, is what make a brand a nice thing to belong to. So if you think about the brands that you love, why do you love them? Why do you love, I don't know, Lululemon, let's say, and I was even listening to this interview with the owner about the name and how it was all to do with Japan. And I think because there's no L pronounced, and that's, how they come up with the name. But it's still very important that you do target the customer that you intend to build it for, because that's going to be your priority. And don't try to cover everyone just for the sake of profit or KPIs. Represent what you build, and I think and love it basically, and see how long you can sustain it for.
That's beautiful. And I love how in your work you do bring folks from different departments, and it truly becomes a team sport to create strategy together in a collaborative fashion. So I have to ask you, Lillian, you come from this incredible background of theater and fine arts and dance. And I think I mentioned to you my little running theory that theater people always end up in design one way or another. So I'm curious, from your background, how do you see that sort of non-traditional background contributes to your success as a leader today?
Well, I think it's because in terms of like what my background's provided me, is because elsewhere in the world, what we used to call pedestrians or lanesmen, we're very much in our heads, in our hands, in our words. And I always have this thing, and I think I mentioned to you the other day, Holly, which is like, show, don't tell. You know, you can show it any way you want. You can do a dance about it. You can draw it. You can build something, but show it. And I feel that this really helps people to become human again, and also like to clarify their ideas. For example, like if you're doing an illustration next to an explanation, that immediately helps you to organize your thoughts and also create these stories, because humans love stories. And, you know, and part of my work was also storytelling, because that's how humans started to, collaborate in such large numbers, is by we're sharing stories together so that we believe in things. For example, like if you think about money, you know, what makes money valuable is a story, is a piece of paper at the end of the day, is a, you know, it's a balance in the account, or like a country, the country's borders. You know, I don't know if you've read the book Sapiens. He really explains that in a lovely way. You know, what makes a person fight in war for a country? Because what is a country? You know, it's a story. And the other thing that I find that really works, it's shared vulnerability in a group, because we have that all the time in theater, in dance. It's like whenever you share vulnerability together, be it in a ridiculous setup or in a sensitive setup, or even trying experimenting together, immediately that will position people in a way that they're gonna bond together, and they're gonna work towards the best way of achieving a certain goal. So for me, that's always been these kind of cues in terms of like my background. It's all about like, you know, showing and also adding to the conversation. So whenever somebody thinks differently from you, because obviously I work with a very diverse groups, if there is a potential for discourse, rather than asking them why, or, you know, I disagree, or but, you know, I make people continue a phrase with like yes and. So if they say something,
yes, perfect improv technique.
Yeah, so yes and then you add something, or, you know, and or we used to do this game calling, you know, fake news, real news, where somebody decides it's like something is fake news and news, and but it's all about these kind of shared experiences. When the minute you share experience with a group, that's it, you bonded. You're gonna clash, but you're gonna bond, and you eventually, because we're such social creatures, you want to find some kind of consensus, or at least you want to be understood, and that's how it's always helped.
Yeah, I love that. You're kind of coming back to what it means to be human. And book recommendation, ladies and gentlemen on the phone, Sapiens. Yeah. And by the way, I should have mentioned much earlier, any audience questions, feel free to just jump in, throw them into the chat. We're going to be taking questions at the end. So as you're listening, if you have questions for any of the panelists, please do throw them in the chat, and we'll take them all at the end.
Yeah, this is Alexandra. Always a test for me. Sorry to interrupt. This is always a test for me, because I feel like, you know, people are just being passive. I want them to join in, join the conversation.
I can tell somebody leads workshops here.
Yeah.
Great. And Alexandra, from your perspective, how do kind of different traditions and different backgrounds contribute to your success as a leader?
Yeah, so first, I think everyone needs Lillian as their hype girl behind them. So, but also I think, you know, coming from a background in sociology and business communications. So first, I mean, that's not typical to lead you into tech by any means. But it's really helped me. It's proven to help me tremendously, because I can really put myself in the shoes of users or just my fellow colleagues. So whether this is building something that's user-centric or not, but I'm able to question and most importantly, listen, and then allows me to communicate better. It's given me, you know, great critical thinking skills, and the ability to really think different and run through those scenarios and options and outcomes. And then I think, I understand what shapes the teams around me, my own team, the colleagues that I'm working with. And I actually think leaning heavily on soft skills rather than technical has been really important and valuable as well. And I think, everything is always teachable, but I think empathy, experimentation, and understanding other people is so important in order to push any of our organizations forward. And so along with that, Lillian, earlier at the top of the call, you had mentioned curiosity, and I would describe that as being really key and kind of indicative of whether someone is really going to succeed or not as well, because having that curiosity to always wanting to discover or kind of push the needle, I think is really valuable in business.
Yeah, I love that. I think it just keeps coming back to that why for me. Why are you building what you're building, and understanding people on that level of humanity and what drives you, and that storytelling. That's it. That's where you get the why. So I can see why this really has helped you as a leader to center users in the decisions that you're making. It's beautiful. And speaking of which, I want to talk about some best practices, perhaps, that each of you have found to center end users in your decision making. And Sarah, you had shared earlier about the Howard Schultz quote and the chair that represents the user and the partners. I'm curious, Sarah, if you can share with us, what are some practices that you like to use that help you to center users?
Well, I think it comes down to the basics, like we're all saying, right? What are you building it for? Know your audience for sure. And you may not know your complete audience, but you should know a good portion of it. You need to engage them in the process. What are they looking for, and what can you deliver? So I always lean on the reporter, the 5 W's and the how, right? So who, what, where, when, how, and why. If you don't have those answered before you go into a major project, you're going to have a problem. You need to know that, and you need to, if you have questions, that's the time to ask. So, and then as we've all said, you need a good feedback method, and be prepared for a plan B, because plan B may come up when you're in the middle of developing plan A, and you need to be able to pivot and go to plan B, or you may have something that completely destroys plan A and you go to plan B. So I think be prepared. And more importantly, if and when you can, work the process yourself. Do what your intended users are doing, and you might be surprised at what you learn. Right. And I have a little magnet on my whiteboard that says seek clarity. And I think really that's what it's all about. You need to seek clarity before you can proceed. And sometimes that's all at once, and sometimes that comes in phases, but definitely, and engage your audience.
Validate, validate, basically.
Yes, validate, exactly. Yeah, clarify and validate. Absolutely, 100%. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think what you said is so key, Sarah, about bringing users to the process. And I think I see so often that we think we know better than users, and we'll create this whole complex strategy only to find out that that's not even a problem that the user was facing at all, or we've completely misunderstood it. So bringing them to the practice, to the process, is so important. Lillian, what are some tips and tricks you maybe can share with us?
Oh, sorry. Can you repeat the question? Because for some
reason,
yeah.
So we've been talking about how important it is to make user-centric decisions. So I want to talk about how we can do that, right? So what are some of the best practices that you found that help you to center users when you're making decisions?
Well, we do, well, like I said, I often will include them as part of our workshops. We're going to do like customer interviews, but also have you guys worked with the business proposition, the value proposition canvas at all? Where you have like the customer jobs, to try to define, basically, get people around the users as well, and try to get their motivations, because that's where we end up separating the user from the human, but actually, trying to understand what that person is socially and emotionally, but also the things that they need to do in order to get these kind of values, these emotional values that they're seeking, let's say security, confidence, or they want some kind of a status, they want to be seen as environmentally friendly or something, or like liking animals, but at the same time they don't want to feel inadequate, or they don't want to look stupid in front of people, or they don't want to feel afraid, and then they want to make money, let's say, but at the same time they also have these kind of things, these kind of matter-of-fact things that can be really distinguished in a kind of day-to-day life job. So what I find with the user is, again, going back to the story, we work with this little kind of like happy part of the customer or the user or the human, and we just do like a day in a life, and we narrow it down to turning the day in a life into actual physical verbs or activity or tasks that that person wants to do, with the motivations and the background of those motivations in the past. So there's all this kind of like, we almost become like these kind of human students as a group. And some of us are better than others, because we have the people from HR, let's say, in your team. But at the same time, you got the finance guy or girl, that doesn't really care about that. And suddenly he's finding all kinds of insights that actually, opportunity. So it's very important, I think, to put a face into who's going to be using your product or your service, rather than just kind of make presumptions, create, because, like in the old days of UX, we had these personas. They used to be very anonymous. Now we want to get to know the personas. We want to kind of hang out with them. I've been working with this project and these clients for ages about event planners. Who is an event planner? And we had all kinds of like insights. We had the expert event planner, but we also had the one-off lady that wants to plan her wedding. You want, or like an anniversary, you want somebody who just wants to plan a meeting. We don't realize how much of a pain in the neck it is to actually organize meetings. And I even ended up, coming up with this whole thing about designing meetings, better approach. So I think
I love that.
So the more we get to know that, to hang out, let's hang out with the user and bring them in. And sometimes obviously it gets a little bit out of hand, because the more the user realizes, what the background and what's involved in building this product for them, they get a bit carried away and they do like this Christmas shopping list. So in the end, we need to kind of like create this awesome view of what would be like their life by using our product, but then narrow it down to the MVP at the end and then validate that. And if it's really worthwhile, you kind of start building the blocks, and that's when you create, but put them, in the process some way. It doesn't have to be throughout the entire build, but at least when you're coming up with the idea and the values.
Yeah. I mean, hearing you saying that, when you get really specific and you actually meet your user, not a vague abstracted persona, but the user, ideas kind of start to flow. And it's amazing. It can be difficult to pop that cork, but once it goes, it's like the floodgates of creativity get open, and that's such a fun moment. And then you got to rein it back in and figure out what's most important. So speaking of getting specific, I want to ask the three of you a question, and I'm asking as a true neutral party because I'm very new to Canadian culture. You're all three operating in different parts of the Canadian market. So let's get local for a moment. Where do you feel that Canadian culture is particularly strong in centering users, and where is there more to learn? And Sarah, let me go to you first.
Well, I thought about this. This is a tough question, right? Really tough question. So I think, first of all, one thing we have to recognize across North America, not just Canada, is that we do have a tendency to put an emphasis on confidence versus competence. And that is a cultural thing, and that can trip you up in many areas, not just design. The other thing that affects Canadians, is the fact that our government is very focused on making sure that every voice or every person has a voice, and that every voice matters. So just like Lillian was saying, just then is quite a good segue, is that, everyone thinks they have the best idea, the best approach, and they all want to be involved. So the key there, I think, is to find that common thread or multiple common threads rather than just designing for one specific group. And I think you only do that by getting people together and kind of pulling that common thread out. And that's a critical piece. So all human users expect to be heard and accommodated at all times is a nice thought, but I would suggest it's probably a little impractical. Yes. Hard to do. Yeah.
Identify who the user is, right?
Yes. Yeah.
Alexandra, what do you think?
So I think on top of that, if I kind of look at it as like in my own personal experiences as well, in the company that I work for, being a global company, I think that coupled with it also being a leader in diversity and inclusion, it really works well for being able to understand and you know, going to Sarah's point that we want to make sure every voice is heard. And so when you are able to work for a company that really walks the walk in wanting our employees to bring their whole self to work, regardless of age or gender, nationality, then when you're living by those commitments and experiences, then when you're, you know, whether it's you're building your product offering or your experiences for your customers, you now have that background as well when you're going into that new development as well. So I think really I would just add from my own personal experience in business, and then, you know, the work is really never done and there's always opportunity to learn more.
That's great. Lillian, I'm going to put you on the spot and ask you the same question because you are a woman of many cultures. What have you observed in Canada?
Actually, for me, it has been a little bit of a culture shock, I have to say, because although I grew up in Quebec City between the ages of like 8 to 18, I spent almost 21 years in London, and I just came back recently. And I'm used to kind of like the British ways, the British deadpan, the sarcastic sense of humor. They used to just go full flat on the floor here when I started to work for Blanks. And also this kind of like cheekiness that the British have of like dancing with the language, you know, and pardon my French, but telling you like to fuck off in a very polite way. And because in Canada, people are very consensus driven. They want everybody to agree with them, and they want to like be inclusive, like the two ladies in this panel have said. They want everybody to be heard. But what I work often in my workshops is very difficult to have a sense of ownership or leadership. I wouldn't say so much, I guess ambition to a certain extent, because they do still like their status here. It's quite, I mean, Montreal, there's quite a lot of materialistic kind of like a mentality here where people like, you know, to show off their homes and things like that. And that's actually quite different from the UK, which is a little bit embarrassing to start showing off your bling and your goodies and everything. But whenever as a coach, I come in as a coach, and obviously me not having any embarrassment whatsoever and being a bit silly sometimes, like people just let me do my thing, and I have to kind of really work with them to say, okay, I'm going to be vulnerable, but you're going to be too, you know, and I want to give them this sense of ownership, because whoever comes in with an idea, they have to really believe in it so that they can drive the team helping them design it. So I have to coach people a lot in terms of becoming leaders and owners without turning into bullies, basically, because there's that either or, you know. It's a bit like sexism in Canada, you know, because although sometimes I feel like the men here don't assert themselves in terms of masculinity enough, but at the same time, they confuse it with being, you know, misogynistic, you know. So this kind of balance to find in a way, because I think, and it's not their fault, because the state, you know, the government here is very much like a nanny state to an extent. People wait for the decisions to be made on their behalf. So, and I think COVID was good for that, to make people more independent. And we're having people approaching us now where they have these new business ideas, they want to pivot because they got tired of waiting, you know, on the news. Okay, what can I do now? Can I open my restaurant? Can I go back to work? You know, so now they like, what can I do regardless of the circumstance? So it's giving that independence to people. Yes, don't be afraid to make decisions, because you're not going to know if you don't really. It's better to do something than nothing at all. And that was my thing that I'm still working on. So I want to explore other sides of Canada. Vancouver really interests me at the moment. So I'll probably be hitting you up, Sarah.
I'm gonna go make a visit with your new friend here.
In Toronto. I mean, we went to Toronto very briefly when he was locked down. So he was still very kind of closed. So, but I could see the mentality was slightly different. But it's fascinating. I mean, I'm always interested in humans in general. And it's fascinating to see how I can adopt my method to different cultures.
Anytime you're ready. Anytime you're ready, come on over.
Definitely.
So listen, we had a couple more questions, but speaking of centering the users, I want to take a beat here. And Marcel, have we got any questions from the audience? Let's prioritize those if so. Okay, I guess we can keep going then.
The comedian. No, I'm joking.
I know. All right.
Don't be afraid, people. We can take it.
We're friendly. We got this. So listen, I think one of the things that we have seen as a theme that's kind of emerging in the conversation is both that users are disparate. They are not a monolith. They are not abstract. There are a lot of diverse users that are out there, and also I think we've continually kind of touched on the fact that you cannot make strategic decisions for everyone. So that definition phase of who is this for and why is it going to help them is so critical. But I'm wondering, because that is still a tendency to kind of think of users as this monolith, and I'm curious, in your day-to-day, how do you remember that they are diverse? How do you account for diverse users of products and services? And Sarah, let me toss this one over to you first.
Well, I've got another quote that I just found the other day when I was just doing some research in preparation for this, and it's by a gentleman called Dane Miller. He was credited with the quote on careerfoundry.com, and it's, "UI is the saddle, the stirrup, and the reins. UX is the feeling you get being able to ride the horse." So I thought that was just a very, being a former horseback rider, that really resonates, right? But I mean, trying to write one thing for multiple people is like trying to get people who have a size 9 foot to wear a size 7 shoe, or vice versa. It's just not going to fit. So again, like we've all said, our users are not all the same. And I think I've always hated the word user in reference to our users, because you do tend to forget that there actually are people there with like 10 fingers and toes and, eyes and ears that are using this. And our job is kind of to make their lives easier. And by making their lives easier, we will bring them back into our fold, and the relationship is founded, right? So I think if you have, just the other day I was in a website and the UI was absolutely terrible. It didn't guide you. It didn't tell you a story. It didn't give you any way to connect with them, and you just kind of put it away, and it's just so poor. And our responsibility as developers, IT professionals, whatever you want to classify as, is to own that product. And if you own a product that is not up to par, shame on you. I think you really, and I think you really have to rethink that and go, okay, I didn't do a good job here, and start over. So that's right. What I would say. You consider
great
people
insight.
are not the same. Yeah.
Great insight. So listen, I think that's a great segue to the final question for all of you. So we started this session by asking what's the best piece of advice you've ever received. And now I want to ask you to share a piece of advice to those who are listening, particularly knowing that there are a lot of young women here that are looking up to you as women in leadership, women in technology. If you could pass on one piece of advice to everyone that's listening out there today, what would that be? And Sarah, let me start with you.
Another question that required some real thought. So lots of advice. One thing that I would say to myself, if I was my younger self starting out today, was I would look to work in a business that speaks to my personal values. Because if you get in a business that doesn't speak to your personal values or opposes them, you're not going to be successful. You're not going to be happy. So that presupposes that you do have a set of personal values. So that is one piece of advice I would say. Create a set of your own personal values. Work at an organization that supports those values and that you can admire, and then also develop a process, and remember that process rarely changes. That's part of your day-to-day. That's what I would say to my younger self.
Lillian?
Yeah, I've got quite a lot of experience in this because I've always been like the minority across all different aspects, is like, the Brazilian, the single female, and especially because in my days, I used to be a developer as well. And you can work both for and against you to be the female. For example, as a female coder, I was always the one that was always questioned when my code was wrong, and the guys would get away with all kinds of things, that they could just hide in their corner. But at the same time, it used to make me more approachable. Therefore, I ended up being like a team lead at a very young age, because people are terrified of the other poor guys just because they're slightly socially awkward. And it made me empathize with everyone in terms of like almost like being a translator. So when I used to have one of the developers that was very awkward about explaining something, I would almost like do the translation for him, what he meant, how would be the approach. But I think that you've probably seen in the past few years, there's a lot of research, and I think it's Credit Suisse, Forbes, a lot of polls like done about, female-led companies tend to perform better like throughout in terms of like social engagement, performance, like satisfaction. And it's not necessarily because there's this kind of superiority about women. It's just because there's I think the more diverse and the more balanced you make a company, it's a fairer reflection of what happens in the outside world. After all, half the population is female. So if you put a company that's got like a good balance between male and female, it tends to perform better. It tends to be a more even keen, in terms of what you're going to achieve as a company. And the survey is that people tend to get much more career satisfaction, much more engagement. And as a female, we tend to be, through survival, we tend to be more perceptive, and we kind of can spot cues in terms of like, feelings, emotions, emotional intelligence, let's say. And this goes back to my days as a developer, like when people wouldn't understand, for example, like the project managers wouldn't know when they were stressing one of my developers, and I could clearly see that one guy was like completely stressed out and people wouldn't spot them, and so I would know how to like buffer them. So I became almost like like the tech mom in many ways, because I was like shielding them to a certain extent. But what I will say to ladies is just like, don't be afraid, like have confidence in your talent and what you bring to the company, because you don't realize how much value you bring to the company as both a female and as an additional expert in your domain, either be development or tech or design, because everybody needs different kind of perspectives from either female or whatever background you come from, because the more diverse it is, the more representative you're going to be of that company. And it tends to happen naturally for females, but for some reason we tend to get more confident in our 40s. I don't know what happened through life. We tend to kind of relax more in our 40s, because before that we try to please, we try to cater for everyone, and you don't have to. If you don't agree and if you don't want to work in a certain way, be heard, put your voice in. And again, show, don't tell.
Great.
So that's my takeaway from that.
Very good. Very good. And Alexandra?
Yeah, so first I want to say thank you just to the other panelists as well, because I've made some mental notes along the way of some great advice that you guys have shared. So I wanted to make sure I shared that with you both too. But my final piece of advice is that you are in the driver's seat. You drive your career. Your employer does not have the steering wheel. And I think to Lillian's point about the confidence thing, you need to hold that steering wheel and make it known what you want. And that can be applied also to your personal life. But I think, do you want to take on more responsibility? Do you want to take another course to skill up? No one knows what you want except for you. And your manager may have, 6 other reports, 2 other reports. He or she cannot keep track of what you've accomplished that year. Unfortunately, there's so much going on. So you need to be your cheerleader, your shining star for yourself. And sometimes you also want to just stick to what you know and keep your head down. That's okay too. Yeah. But I think be intentional with your actions, take risks, and find what inspires you and find what route you want to drive down, and then just make it known. And I think that can be really, really important.
Thank you so much, Alexandra, Lillian, Sarah. You all had so many incredible insights to share. And I just want to thank all three of you for agreeing to be part of this panel. I had a blast. I hope that you did. I hope everyone listening did as well. This session will be available on the Avenue Code YouTube. So share with your friends and family, anyone who wasn't able to make it. And thank you so much for participating. Hope we'll speak again soon.
Thank you, ladies. Nice to meet you all.
Thank you. Great to meet you all as well.
Thank you, everybody.
All right.
Thank you,
Take
quiet
care.
audience.
Bye-bye.
Bye.